So thanks a lot for everybody for joining us and for another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Federico Sturzenegger with us. Hi, Federico.
Hello.
Federico Sturzenegger is the Minister for Deregulation and State Transformation in Argentina, which takes on an important role. And he will talk about chainsaw in deregulation, the first year of Javier Milei's presidency in Argentina. So let me give you a few opening remarks and then we pass on the mic to Federico. The key questions we would like to address here is what are the roots of Argentinian's President Milei's economic philosophy? Why are so many regulations suboptimal and excessive in a sense, and other times not enough? And when is the chainsaw approach the optimal approach, and when is the pruning shears approach the optimal approach? And what can actually other countries learn from Argentina, what they are currently going through, some important policy experiment. And so let me start with Javier Milei's economic views as it fits in the economics of ideas. Of course, it starts with Ludwig von Mises, and there are two branches essentially. One is the Anarcho-Capitalists, and Javier Milei essentially says he is an Anarcho-Capitalist. But when you look at the action, he's probably more a classical liberal, similar like F.A. Hayek. So you have on the one hand Rothbard more representing the Anarcho-Capitalism, and Hayek the classic liberalism. So what's the difference? The difference is the Anarcho-Capitalists, they would like to essentially abolish many government institutions, while classic liberalism, they would like more rule-based interventions rather than abolishing institutions altogether. The Anarcho-Capitalists, they are very much in favor of private arbitration, private courts, while Hayek also sees an important role for the legal system, the common law system, an Anglo-Saxon way, and the spontaneous order, how the order evolves and spontaneously comes out of that. There's also difference in terms of things like how to organize the social safety net, though there's more, the anarchists are much more about charities and private insurance. And also in terms of the monetary arrangement, there's a disagreement between whether you follow a gold standard or free banking. There's a controversy, there are different sub-branches then evolving. And while Hayek's currency views have changed a lot over his lifetime, at the end he was very much in favor of currency competition between a private and a public currency arrangement. But overall, if you listen to Javier Milei, he talks a lot about the anarcho-capitalism, but the action, I would say, is probably much more classic liberalism, and I probably will be corrected later on, but I think that's probably much more in line with what Hayek would be thinking about. So the first question essentially is, why do we see so much regulation? And sometimes regulation is actually done to protect certain interests. And this goes back, to Mansur Olson's famous insight. Many regulations, there are few large winners who have a lot of interest to lobby for that, and the losses are dispersed among the average citizens, and they can organize themselves the same way as few large winners can organize themselves. The other thing is that most of our regulations don't have a sunset provision. So even if the environment changes, technology changes and everything, they stay in power, or and they're outdated and they don't change, and they accumulate over time. The regulations become more and more, even though many of them are totally outdated, and it's very hard to get rid of them because there are large interests associated with them. And the third element is that often we have supranational regulations on top of the national regulations, and ideally the supranational should actually replace the national ones. But what happens in reality often is that the supranational are just add-ons and have special rules and special exceptions and for another national regulations. You see this a lot in the European Union going on. So all of these elements lead actually to more and more regulation. The question is, how can we organize something where we can actually get updated regulation all the time? And there are two approaches. One I call this pruning approach, and one is the chainsaw approach Javier Milei is constantly is proposing. The pruning approach, the continuous pruning of regulation reforms, that goes a little bit to the analogy of Hayek's gardener metaphor. So I said Hayek, essentially it's like you have constantly, there's some regulation, you have to adapt and change them, and also you have some creative destruction also in terms of regulation. That's similar to Schumpeter's creative destruction in the industry sense and the firm sense. And ideally then you say the total amount of regulation should stay constant but constantly adjust. But what we see much more is that you will see occasionally some large disruptions or even revolutions. And it's then the case when the dispersed public really learns that the system is not, optimized anymore for them. And there are a lot of accumulated lobby interests. And then rather than have a constant pruning and changing, you have occasionally a large disruption. And that's the chainsaw approach in a sense. And of course, once you go for the chainsaw approach, there might also be some collateral damage on democracy and all this. So one has to watch out for that as well. And the third approach, essentially, which is something, to what extent can artificial intelligence help us to screen for certain not so useful regulation or outdated regulation and reduce bureaucracy? Perhaps there's a new way of digitizing and organize bureaucracy much more efficiently. Even though we have a lot of regulations, but now with artificial intelligence, we probably can handle them more efficiently. So the third question was, what can other countries learn from the experience in Argentina? Of course, they have a lot of historical experiences where we remove price caps and slash those of fiscal investments when there's a situation where there's pent-up inflation essentially going on. So we saw this in Germany after the Second World War, where Ludwig Erhard was actually liberalizing all the prices. It was not a one-day event, it was over many, many years where I did it, and that led to this so-called Wirtschaftswunder in Germany. You also saw it in Central and Eastern Europe, and one example is in Poland, Leszek Balcerowicz was a very prominent figure opening up and re-liberalizing prices. Of course, there also, in Chile, there's economically not some improvements in the 80s. And you also saw India's economic liberalization opening up with Mohammed Singh in the early 90s. But the question is, that's historically, what can we learn? What can other countries learn? And I think there's probably a big difference. Countries which have a very dysfunctional economy, then perhaps the chainsaw approach might be more the appropriate one. But for the United States, with Doge, like Elon Musk, learning from Milei and others, it might not be the same situation the US faces than dysfunctional economies face. So it might be more the pruning shears and rather than a chainsaw you need. Similarly for EU, but I think there's a global change in mood how to approach regulation. And Federico, I think, is one of the founding fathers or big figures in driving this global movement going on. So with this, I stop my introductory remarks and pass on the mic to Federico. We're looking forward to learn from your experience, because it might also help other countries to make the economy more efficient, also for the general person, general citizen, to benefit better from the economy. So thanks again, Federico. And I stopped sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, Markus. Let me just I thought perhaps it was a good point to start by giving you a little bit of background what has happened this year in Argentina. And so here I have a number of charts. On the upper left-hand side, you see inflation. You can see that the dotted line, of course, is when Milei took over. And you can see that inflation, we had a big spike of inflation at the moment he took office, but then inflation has really been plummeting and it has been falling. Wholesale inflation that we like to see as an anticipation has been barely 0.6% in December, so dramatic. It was 25. It was very 25% in December of last year. The second graph to the right is output. So you see, Argentina was basically coming into Milei came into government with Argentina in a recession, and the recession kind of deepened in the first 4 months of 2024. But you can see that there's been a significant recovery since April onwards. And in fact, output is going to finish probably in December. When Milei finishes his first year, is going to finish 2 or 3% above the level that the economy had when he took office. The lower left graph is real wages. again, big spike of inflation, reduction in real wages in December, January of last year. There has been a recovery. Again, real wages are higher than when Milei took office. And perhaps one of the most stunning results has been the poverty rate, which again also spiked with the inflation spike as the previous government was finishing the previous presidency. But you can see in this graph that there's been a dramatic plummeting of poverty rates to a level much below the one Milei inherited. Okay, so there are some basic economic figures. The two graphs on the right, which I don't know if you can fully see them, indicate in the upper graph is government expenditure, and you can see that immediately as Javier Milei took office, he had a significant reduction in government expenditure, which reached around 30% year on year in real terms, and it has remained around that level since. So there was a dramatic immediate reduction in the level of government expenditure, which basically implied that the government moved in the first month of Milei's presidency into a surplus, which is a little bit of an unheard thing in Argentina. And that has been sustained, and the president is really very, very focused on this issue. So Argentina has finished 2024 with a fiscal surplus, which actually didn't have for decades.
So the real
so I think this is it. I think perhaps
the mostly went down because of lack of decline in investments, of government investments, I guess.
The government expenditure.
Yes, so you cut back on social expenditures, but also mostly on investments, I guess.
Yeah, we did not cut at all on social expenditures. In fact, social expenditures actually increased. Was the only item in the government's agenda where government increased, but basically it was I would say two very significant items which were cut were transfers to the provinces and public works, which typically were works which really corresponded to the provinces and the municipality, but were channeled through the national government with a really, really significant corruption ring associated to it. And I'm going to explain in a minute that we've actually cut employment, which cut public sector wages and several other issues which actually explain the reduction. I don't know if you managed to see this is the popularity of Milei. It has remained pretty stable throughout the year, with more than half of the population approving his presidency, his government. And in fact, you see at the end, it actually spikes up. It's right now, January he achieved the best numbers in terms of popularity, with 60% of the population approving Milei's government. Okay, so I think this is kind of interesting. What are the two main ideas that Milei has been pushing? I think which are the main sources, the big backbones of his idea. The first one is this idea of having a fiscal surplus. The president believes that much of the problems of Argentina really are the result of this chronic situation of fiscal deficits, and the reduction of the achieving of the fiscal surplus, he says, has to be achieved not through an increase in taxation, but through a reduction in government expenditure. That's where the name chainsaw comes from, no? The idea that we're going to chop down government expenditure. We tend to believe that lots of things that government do are useless, as you were saying, Markus, are the results of interests which have built a constituency there. So we'll get into that into detail in a second, but I would say the first main idea is that Argentina is going to have a fiscal surplus, and that fiscal surplus is going to be obtained by a reduction in government expenditure. This actually reminds me, of these works by Giavazzi and Alesina, where they looked at the fiscal adjustments in Europe, and they basically concluded that the fiscal adjustments which were driven by a reduction in government expenditure were expansionary. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that because Argentina was off debt markets, everything that the government spent was actually paid by taxpayers. Okay, it was either paid in taxes, or it was paid through money printing, which basically generated inflation, which was the inflation tax. So when the government reduces government expenditure, which I said was about 30% real, which was around 5% of GDP, this basically implied a reduction one in the taxes the government was charging the population, particularly the inflation tax, which is the first one, which plummeted. And the fact that the private sector saw that, but there were other formal taxes which were reduced as well, So the government basically immediately had an effect of crowding into private expenditure as a result of the reduction in the taxes. So we find this is very interesting because, I mean, there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to reduce government expenditure, but sometimes one of the reasons is, oh, you're going to trigger a recession. And we basically say, no, we're not going to trigger a recession. That kind of the Keynesian multiplier is more a partial equilibrium exercise. It's not a general equilibrium exercise. Once you reduce government expenditure, if you reduce at the same time the taxation on the private sector, you're going to have the private sector expanding. And this is what we saw. No? We saw this 2024, where government expenditure falls 5% of GDP, and the economy ends up growing 3% of GDP. So I think this is either two very interesting lessons here. One is, don't be worried about the recessionary effects of fiscal cut. Well, Alesina had already said that before, but it also can be done. I mean, you have to be bold enough and understand that there are many areas, at least in the case of Argentina, where this adjustment can be done. And the last point I want to make on this is that this policy is tremendously progressive. The reason is because most of these fiscal excesses were being financed with taxes which were on the poor, of which the inflation tax is just the extreme case. So you reduce the government expenditure, reduce the taxes on the poor. That's why we saw this dramatic fall in the poverty rates, and that is why we see this substantial popularity of President Milei. So that's kind of one line. We're going to focus on this in a second, and then the second line is deregulation. Deregulation is the removal of bureaucratic restrictions, red tape. We have geological layers of regulations which restrict markets, and the idea is we have a very strong belief in the power of economic freedom as a mechanism to generate prosperity. So the idea of economic freedom is kind of the basis of the regulation. Now, as we've been working on this agenda, we've realized that the regulation has several features. Of course, it's very pro-business because it's pro-individuals kind of taking kind of their lives in their own hands and kind of pushing ahead their own personal agendas. But then we realized that it's very pro-entrepreneurship and it's very pro-small and medium-sized enterprises, because regulation is a killer of small firms, because it imposes like a fixed cost, which maybe a large firm can kind of go over that hurdle, but for someone who's starting their businesses, it's just impossible to trespass. So we basically say the agenda of the regulation is that the regulation of the common people is the regulation of the small firm and the small entrepreneur. And at the same time, that the regulation agenda, I think, is the most powerful anti-corruption agenda, because all of this regulation is an opportunity for corruption. And so I think that's kind of, perhaps this is not so important in other countries, but you bet it's important in the case of Argentina.
So can I just ask about the fiscal surplus issue?
Yeah, sure.
So you cut a lot of the transfers to the regional governments. What do the regional governments do?
Yes.
They're cut back as well, or they can get in their own debt? Or do they have any capacity to issue their own debt, the regional governments? Or
no, they don't have capacity to issue their debt, because Argentina is not a country which is very credible, even though the changes and neither are the provincial governments. So they've basically we forced on them to some extent a cut in their expenditures. Some have kind of increased some taxes, etc. But I would say in general terms, government expenditure has fallen at the three levels of government, and it has fallen at the provincial and municipal, because the government has kind of reduced these transfers that they were doing. Okay?
And would you even argue that the fiscal multiplier is negative in a sense, or this only applies to...
I'm totally convinced that it's negative, because from a macroeconomic, the problem with the multiplier as a theoretical construct, when you see it in the textbooks, is that you say G is going to increase, but you don't ask how the G is going to be financed. Okay, so if I'm going to increase G and I'm going to increase taxes, I may have a positive multiplier from the G, but I have an equivalent negative multiplier from the T, correct? And if you kind of don't put the two things in the same boat, you're going to miss the general equilibrium effect of government expenditure. But government expenditure in turns to be pretty inefficient, okay? So it's a deviation of resources to things that tend to be relatively little efficiency. So if you can actually bring this down, in addition of having no macroeconomic effect, because as we said, the reduction in government expenditure is compensated by a crowding in of private expenditure, you actually have people doing useful things, investing in kind of things that generate growth. So definitely we would believe in this government that the fiscal multiplier is negative. No question about that.
In Argentina, but it might be
Let me
different
tell you a
from
little
country to
bit
country,
about.
I guess.
Eh?
It depends how deep in the difficulties a country
No,
is.
yeah.
Yes.
No, I'm telling you how we feel it here, and we're pretty convinced. And I would say to some extent what has happened in 2024, 1-point econometrics, so we shouldn't kind of take it too far, but definitely what we saw in 24 kind of goes along this story I'm telling you, okay? Now, let me dwell a little bit into the chainsaw, which is this reduction in government expenditure. We had chainsaw 1.0, which would be, maybe you find that we did is a little bit dramatic, but we would say this was the pruning, okay? So basically what we did is we cut 30% of the government structure, the kind of the amount of agencies and positions in the agency. We cut that kind of very quickly. Then we cut public employment. I don't know if it's very small there down to the left, but those bars are basically indicating the reduction in government employees that we've executed this year. So the centralized administration, we started with 210,000 employees, and now we're down to 175. So we've reduced 15% the number of public employees. So it's a pretty interesting cut there. But if you see the graph, I don't know if you see in the graph that it doesn't seem to stop, correct? So this is actually continuing. Actually, I would even suggest that maybe starting into 2024, it may accelerate a little bit, okay? And I'll explain where the acceleration is coming from. And then the other graph that you have there is the real wages of public employees. So you see that with the inflation spike, you had a reduction of the real wages, but then you can see that they have really stayed relatively low. So there has been kind of a permanent cut in the value of public sector wages. So all those things combined, and somewhat of this also happened with pensions. So the combination of all these things, the reduction of transfer to the provinces, the reduction of the stopping of the public works, which corresponded to things that should have been done by the provinces and municipalities, the number of employees and the reduction in public wages and the reduction in pensions gives you this 30%. Now moving into 24, we go into what we call the chainsaw 2.0, which we call the deep chainsaw, okay? So what is the deep chainsaw? We basically did this exercise in the cabinet that we ask ourselves, what should a libertarian government do or not do? So the president contacted, we spent a whole cabinet meeting discussing the president with the minister this question. So for example, we said, if it's something that the private sector can do, then we shouldn't do it, okay? Or if it's something that really is more corresponds to a competency of a municipality, a city, or a province, a state, we shouldn't do it. Or maybe it's something we just don't think that should be done by the government. So I have 3 examples here, which I think is maybe illustrates, maybe I'll just do 2 of them. For example, example 3 is housing. So we say housing, we don't think the national government should build houses, okay? But we had a whole area in the Ministry of Economy which was dealing with building houses, okay? We think that for the housing market, we have to provide a stable economy and basically have the government be smaller, so the financial sector, we have some crowding in the financial sector, and that's it. So basically we are eliminating all the area in the ministry which has to do with housing, okay? Example 1, which is their CONAMI, basically is there's a law of the previous government where the government had to devise a program to do micro lending, okay? So that's basically something that the private sector is much better prepared to do, and it's something that the financial sector, that's very difficult, it's very local, to give a micro lending, a loan of $100 to someone. So, okay, so we said this we should not do. We basically closed this area. But I'll just give you an example. This was an area which was supposed to create, let's say, a base of credits for the underprivileged, okay? So the stock of credits this area had built today was equivalent to 0.15 of the resources which had been invested in the area over the last 15 years. So let me just be clear about this, okay? So 99.85% of the money were lost in bad loans or through the bureaucratic and political process which was being financed to give these loans. Today, basically only 0.15% of the money remained, okay? So that's kind of a total nonsense.
Do you also have something like a PPP, a private-public partnership initiative as well? Or you think everything has to be either government or private?
I don't know. We tend not to be honest, we don't tend to be very dogmatic. So if we find something where that should be, but so far no example comes to my mind, okay? Maybe in road concessions and things like that, you may have you may basically have a public good which is basically handled by the private sector.
And is the underlying reasoning more focusing what's a market failure, or is that?
Well, for market failure, let's go to talk to deregulation, okay? And but let me just say one thing. You know, the basic paper of market failures is Akerlof's The Market for Lemons, okay? And remember, his example was used cars. Yet, in the U.S., used car market is not regulated, okay? So the fact that you have a market failure doesn't necessarily mean that the best solution is to regulate the market. So I'll just leave that as a quote there, as a comment to discuss later, okay? Let me just move to I told you that one thing was the fiscal surplus through reduction in government expenditure. That's the chainsaw. This is the mechanisms we're implementing to reduce government expenditure. Sorry, let me go back here for a second. What we're doing now is we're actually going through the whole government and asking people, what do you do? And when they answer us what they do, we check if it's in the list of things that we think a libertarian government should do, or it's in the list of things that we think the libertarian government should not do. If it's in the not do, then we close the area, we shut down the area, and then we move on, okay? So, and this is a process. This is why I say the chainsaw 2.0 maybe accelerates the reform of the state relative to what we did in year one. Okay, so let me now move to deregulation. I want to start for a second with a short diagnosis of why the need for deregulation. And basically this is think of Acemoglu Robinson, correct? Yes. And he says societies tend to drive to generate institutions which basically are non-inclusive. Okay, this is basically, these are the reason countries fail. Well, Argentina would be the basket case of that, okay? And so Argentina is a status quo society where the basis of that status quo is very strong, is very rich, and is very stable. For example, if you look at the union leaders in Argentina, they have been the same people for the last 40 years. When I mean the same people, I'm talking the same physical person, okay? The same person with the same name and last name. Not that I mean that you have the truck drivers and they have a strong union. It's the leader of the truck driver association, union, is the same person for the last 40 years. And so that's tremendously stable. And when you look at the business leaders in Argentina, they have been the same for the last 20 years, okay? And this status quo, which has basically appropriated rents from the rest of society, has a very, I would say, efficient political representation, which is the Peronist Party. The Peronist Party, for us, is the party of the status quo, is the party of created interest. That's why I say the Peronist Party is the conservative party of Argentina. It's the party of of the political class, of the union class, and of a part of the business. Of course, when we talk about business, we cannot generalize, correct? There are parts of business which are victims of this system, okay? So how do you break this system where you have a rich, strong, stable number of actors which have instituted the system which creates rents for them, of course, who pays for those rents and those benefits is the population at large. Well, we need to change the law because this system is built in the law, okay? So that's why I have a friend which says in Argentina the problem is not illegal things, the problem in things are legal things, because these privileges are ingrained in the law. For example, if I tell you that unions in Argentina basically collect 3% of the total wage bill of Argentina every month, you would basically say you're joking, correct? Well, the law in Argentina allows them to collect 3% of the wage bill every month, okay? So this is
Of
what
the
I'm
union
talking
members or any worker?
No, that's for surprising. The union members all obviously contribute, but the law says that non-union members also have to contribute by the same amount. So not even a lower amount, the same amount. Okay, so, and this is in the law, so you have to change that. Okay, so what we did is we started working on this in May of 2022. So this is 2 years ago, a project where we wanted to review the whole legal system of Argentina. So this meant that we were going to review everything, okay? And we wanted, our objective was to classify the laws into laws that we thought were okay, laws that we thought had to be repealed in totum, and laws that had needed to be changed. But then what we did is we wrote the alternative, okay? So I'm going to tell you a little bit how we did that. I'm going to skip here a few slides because I'm running a little bit late on time. We lost too much time with the setting up of the presentation. Anyway, so how did we do this job? We did this job asking people to help us. But we did not allow and we did not do any meetings. So let me just give you an example. We have to review the environmental laws. Okay, so we asked for someone which we thought kind of had the same approach and the same view of things that we had. We said, can you give us a hand with the environmental laws? So the person said, okay, let's do a meeting. I'll explain to you what we're doing. I said, no, we don't do meetings. Okay, so says, I'll send you a paper. We wrote a paper about the challenges in environmental law in Argentina. No, we don't read papers. Okay, so you want me to send you some bullets? I can send you a bullet with the main topics. No, I don't read bullets. What do you want? What the hell do you want? Okay, said, no, I don't know. What are the problems? The problems is, let's say, for example, the glaciers law. Argentina has a law where if you have a glacier, you cannot do any economic activity, which is totally fine. But the law defines an area surrounding the glacier which is undefined, and in some cases it's so big there are provinces which have basically totally precluded economic activity in the mountains, mining, for example, because of how. So we have a problem with this law. Okay, we have a problem with this law. We agree that we have a problem with the law. So basically what we ask them is basically take down from the web the law and start typing in the law what would the changes you would do. And send me the changes that you would do on the law, okay? We didn't do meetings, we didn't write papers, we didn't do analyze bullets, we didn't do philosophical meetings about what to do. Just send me what would be your suggestion, and then we work on the basis of that. Because what we needed was to have a body of laws that we could change if we actually made it to government, okay?
But is there a danger that mostly lawyers respond to your requests and economists said, oh, I'm not familiar with the law?
Well, what happened is that we got to the point of where I want you to send me the edited version of the law. 70% of the people we were talking with disappeared for different reasons. Maybe someone was willing to give me their ideas, but was not willing to work 2 months working out through the nitty-gritty of a law. Maybe someone was afraid of changing the law. I was a member of parliament, so I'm not so respectful, okay? And I'm not so afraid of changing the law, okay? And some people, maybe they weren't that good enough that they could actually feel that they could get into the details. I mean, here, many times these things, the devil is in the details. So what's interesting of the methodology is it allowed me to get to the people who were willing to do the job without losing time, correct? Because I didn't have 5 meetings with a person and then the person didn't deliver. Give me the delivery and then we'll start the discussion.
Why do you call it the principle of Marx?
No, the principle of Marx is I basically say it's not Carlos Marx, it's not Groucho Marx, it's Daniel Marx, who is a friend of mine whose name happens to be Marx. And I have this, but I'll tell you what the story is. when I was in 2001, he was Secretary of Finance. I was Secretary of Political Economy in the government of Argentina. We had a big discussion with the finance minister, which was Domingo Cavallo, a legendary finance minister of Argentina. And we were discussing to do A or B, and after a discussion of about 6 hours, we decided we were going to do A, okay? The next morning, Cavallo signs the decree, and the decree said B. So I said, Daniel, what happened here? Yesterday we discussed A, and then he signed B. And then Daniel Marx says, this friend of mine says, no, what happened is the lawyer came to Cavallo with the decree, and the decree said B. So what I'm trying to say here? That in politics, the person who wins the debate, this is what I call the principle of Marx, is the person who puts the paper on the table, who says, this is the solution, this is the change you have to write in the law. If it's just a discussion, oh, with the glaciers this, the glacier that, the politician cannot do anything with that, okay? Now, if you bring them the law, which says this is what has to be changed, then the politician can move ahead. So the principle of Marx was to put in on the table the laws that had to be changed, okay? Okay, so we decided to do that, and the result was these 2 piles. These are actually the real, original, I have them in my office here. The left pile was all the laws that had to be repealed, and the right pile were all the laws that had to be changed because we already had written the changes, okay? So actually I had done this work for another presidential candidate, which is Patricia Bullrich. When she lost to Milei in the election, we decided to take this to Milei. So I took to Milei these 2 piles that you're seeing here in this picture, and we started discussing all the reform program, and he said we have to do all this. And but we had the principle of Marx here, because we were putting on, it was not that I was going to tell him this and then letting someone else bring the paper of what has to be done. Okay, this is the paper, okay? And this became the beginning of the Milei administration to some extent, of course, with the contribution of all the people who were participating in the government. But there were 2 very significant pieces of legislation. One was the Executive Decree 7023, so that Milei issued 10 days into his office. It was a huge decree, which our constitution allows us in emergency cases, allows the government to issue, to change laws and to modify laws, okay? So basically we said, we're basically running into a hyperinflation. You saw it in the graph, that we need to give a very strong signal that the country is changing course. Okay, so this is a package of reforms which repeals dozens of laws, tens of laws, changes tens of laws, and this is basically a new beginning for Argentina. So this was the Executive Decree 7023, which contained a lot of the things that were in the 2 piles that you saw before, okay? Plus, of course, contribution of other people who were putting.
So Gabriela has a question here. So this principle of Marx, does it not favor lobbyists who have a whole legal team or can make recommendations to the law itself relative to non-experts?
We were going to beat the legal team by putting our view on the table, because if not, they are the ones who put it on the table, and we were going to do it fast. So we were not going to give them the time to react, okay? And this is basically, so here we have changes, for example, in the medicine law, which had been discussed for 20 years in Argentina, which had been sent to Congress several times, that then were changed, and okay, here it kind of went seamless, because nobody believed that the President Milei, in his 10th days in office, was going to be able to put on the table such a dramatic reform, which had specific changes on so many laws, okay? But of course, we had been working on this for 2 years, okay? And then we sent to Congress an even bigger package, which was the basis law, which was discussed for 6 months in Congress, what was approved on the 8th of July of last year. And I would say that one of the important things that it has is its Article 3, which basically for 1 year has granted the government the power to change laws if the government deems that what's contained in the law is something which is a government intervention which we deem that is unnecessary, okay? So I don't know, you see a picture there, correct? And the picture says faltan 166 días, okay? We still have 166 days, okay? So this is how the clock is looking in my office right now as I'm speaking to you. And this is basically saying to my team, we still have 166 days until these delegated powers that the Congress has given us expires, okay? So we see this clock coming down, you know, every day, and it's kind of gives us a sense of urgency that we need to finish the job in the next 166 days, okay? So, but the basis law, in addition of these delegated powers, had a lot of reforms, okay? A second wave of reforms. Now, how do we do, after the executive decree and the basis law, how are we working now, okay? And what are we working on? So, of course, our legal review gives us a lot of hints as to where we have to work on, so we start there. Then we actually listen a lot to society, because society is the one which is more angry and hurt by these government regulations. So it doesn't mean that if someone comes, we're going to take it for good, okay? We're going to analyze it. But we listen to chambers, associations, and we open up the website for the population to tell us which are the regulations which bother them. And we get hundreds and thousands of recommendations.
How do you go through them? Do you have some artificial intelligence or some large language models to manage that? Or?
We basically categorize them with artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. So, for example, now we have 8,000 suggestions. So we put them all through ChatGPT, mm-hmm. and ChatGPT basically says, "Oh, this is transport, this is agriculture," mm-hmm. and then we start working from there with the teams. Okay.
When you listen to society, they don't have to specify how the law should be changed. They can just say what.
But we do ask them to tell us which is the law and the regulation that is bothering them. Because if you just leave an open conversation, mm-hmm. for example, I opened up my email and people were writing to my email, and that was tremendous. I mean, got a tremendous amount of ideas, but a lot were opinions. Okay, and so it really takes us a lot of time to process that. So when we did this thing, we said, okay, you have to tell me which law or regulation or decree is bothering you, and well, people put it. Okay, so we get so that allows us to focus very quickly. And the other thing that we use is something we call price differentials. I mean, if for example, I find that in Argentina a Toyota Yaris, which is an entry-level Toyota, cost around the same price of a Tesla in the U.S., well, I know I have a problem, correct? Or if I find that prescription drugs in Argentina are 5 times more expensive on average than in Spain, and 24 times more expensive than in India, well, I know I have a problem there. Okay, so we're using price differential as a way of identifying where we should be working on. Okay. Okay, so let me just do a few comments. I want to talk a little bit about who is resisting regulation and some results and some examples. Well, I would say that bureaucracy is a big resistance, because for the bureaucracy is basically the regulation is scope for corruption, so it's a scope for business, it's a scope for power, and it's a source of employment. Okay, so many reforms which are obvious that should, and I don't have time to get into the details, but you see that bureaucracy is resisting, and it's a kind of it entails a lot of work convincing the organization to get rid of that, okay? And then, of course, you have the interest. But in the case of interest, I would say have not been a significant hindrance for my job so far, for something which I think is very interesting, which is the president. I'll give you an example. I say that such a deregulation has to be gone. Getting rid of that regulation affects a particular industry, okay? Of course, benefits the consumer. That's Mansur also, yes. Correct? So we're kind of getting the logic of collection action in reverse, okay? So you say, okay, we're going to defend the consumer, okay. Of course, I say the firm, I say the industry, I say in a public presentation. It gets on the newspapers. Immediately, the president retweets it.
Okay.
When the president retweets it, the lobbyist doesn't know what to do, because the lobbyist said, well, the president has already expressed that he's okay with this deregulation. So the guy says, basically it's gone. The resistance is gone. So I tell the president that the president has a style which is very supportive of his ministers. Say, maybe you're just doing it because you want to support us and that's the way you are. But maybe you don't realize that by doing that, you're clearing our path and allowing us to move very swiftly because the resistance of the lobbyists is very small.
So Olivier actually is asking the question, what forms does the bureaucracy resistance actually take? Do you have some examples where say, oh, you see some, how do they resist it essentially? Do you have what forms does resistance by the bureaucracy take? Can you give us some examples?
Well, I'll give you an example. We have, for example, we had something which is that when you were importing something, customs had the authority to say that did not agree with the price that you were showing in your invoice. So, for example, let's take a real case, okay, which is tires, okay? So you say, I'm importing this tire from Michelin. Here's the invoice from Michelin. It says that this tire is 100, and then custom would say, no, I think the tire is 500, not 100. And this is not a made-up number, okay? So the price, this reference price was 5 times the actual price. So I say, no, it's 100, no, it's 500, no, it's 100, no, it's 500. We get into this discussion. Okay, so the customer says, okay, give me you have to buy an insurance for the tariff difference between 100 and 500, okay? And then we'll figure out the thing, okay? So you buy the insurance, which is, of course, already a cost, but then you have this thing lingering there in your paper, and you're paying this fee every month. So something which is totally ridiculous, okay? Now, what happened? 4, 5, 6 months into the thing, the custom officer would come and say, you know, it doesn't make any sense to keep this thing. Why don't you give me a little bit of money, and then I'll close the case and say that actually the Michelin invoice is a real Michelin invoice and it's 100, okay? So this, which is totally ridiculous because it increased, it was like a tariff to the custom officer, correct? Where the income of this tariff, with all, of course, the hassle, the bureaucratic hassle and the cost for firms of actually dealing with this. So it took us 4 months to of course, I was discussing with the head of customs, which was very aligned with us, and he agreed totally, but then he went to kind of get the things done in customs, and then they built 100 numbers of explanations as to why this thing should remain. Well, it took us basically 4 months until we actually got rid of this, okay? So this would be an example, and sorry if it took me a bit long.
And can you also say, whenever you say something, what is also useful for other countries to adopt? What could the US or Europe adopt, essentially?
I would say that, for example, when you have this, you were discussing the trimming versus a chainsaw, okay? You were thinking more applying the chainsaw to the deregulation. I would say if the regulation is the result of a lobby by an interest, I don't see any room for the trimming, correct? That you just have to chop that from. And so I think perhaps, for example, Department of Government Efficiency, and say, imagine that Elon Musk would call me and say what recommendation I have. I would say the thing is not making efficient what you have. The question is asking yourself if this thing the government is doing should be there or not. So you have to ask yourself first a deeper question before you actually tackle the idea of actually simplifying or improving the efficiency. So I would say it's not more Department of Government Efficiency, it's Department of Government Destruction, Department of Government Interpellation, I don't know, give it the number you want. But I mean, you have to question yourself, and I would say I think it's a very interesting, idea that I would like to share.
Is the tax compliance, has it improved? You know, if you cut back, let's say, on tax auditors, did the amount of taxes you collect, did it go down? Or how do you deal with this?
I think that the compliance, Argentina has a very large informal sector, and I think that comes because it has very high taxes on labor. So firms hire labor in the informal market, half of our labor force in informal, and then that forces them to sell in the informal market because they have to kind of have a channel there. So I think the tax compliance is going to improve when we are sufficiently successful in bringing down government expenditure that we can actually tackle and reduce taxes on labor, okay? And I think that will create
Do you plan to do something on the payment system to make it more digital and then what?
Well, Argentina has a tremendously digital payment system. In fact, in my previous life as governor of the central bank, we pushed that digitalization, and I would say, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, in the last 5 years, the use of cash fell to 20% of it was 5 years ago. So that's an agenda where I think is in very good hands in the central bank, and I think we're in that agenda particularly. I think we're far ahead of many other countries. Let me just do my last 2 slides. So that's just here to show you a little bit of some results. So, for example, the one on the left is in the Executive Decree 7023. We freed the rental market for housing. We had a law which basically tied up the way contracts should be done in terms of length, indexation, etc. We basically had taken the supply of rentals to zero. And so we basically allowed the contracts to be totally free. You can sign a contract in the currency with indexation clause that you want, for the length that you want, with the conditions that you want. And you can see there, it's the orange line in the left graph, that basically the supply of rentals is skyrocketed, and the real value of rentals fell 30%, okay? And it's a dramatic success, and I mean, people were not finding apartments. They had to move from neighborhood. They had to move the kids from school because they had.
So you had a lot of empty rental units sitting around.
Lots of rental. Of course, empty. People would not be willing to rent because imagine that you could not index your apartment and inflation is 200%. It's kind of a total nonsense. The graph in the middle is the price of textiles. So you can see how it had increased prior to our deregulation reforms, which basically have opened up trade somewhat and have eliminated a lot of non-customs barriers and obligations that textile producers had. And you can see here how the relative price of textile has really collapsed. And the same has happened here. I have the price of iron. Okay, you can see how the price of iron we also deregulated significantly the iron market. I have kind of a rule of thumb, which kind of is ridiculous, but it's basically wherever you deregulate, the prices fall in real terms around 30%. This is kind of a ballpark figure that I'm seeing. Okay. Now I want to finish with.
Also, Jeffrey, is that these are all very specific to Argentina. You cannot translate it to the United States. And there are not so many empty rental units sitting around, I guess. Or textile prices.
I think that I think you have to do more change, so both in the regulation and in government expenditure. But I do agree that Argentina had a level of this functionality that is totally different from that of the U.S. So it's different thing. But I want to tell you about the deregulation dynamics. So this is a story. You deregulate an area. What happens? Does something happen? And I give you 3 examples of the regulations where what happened was totally different. Okay, so the first one is airlines. We did a huge deregulation of the airline industry, and one particular deregulation that I'm very excited about is the fact that we allowed people who have airplanes which have less than 19 passengers can really set up an airline very easily, because Argentina is a country which is very low. It has low population and is very sparse. So it's perfect for, let's say, airlines which have small planes, okay? You're not to a mid-sized city, you're not going to go there with a 747, but maybe you go with a plane with 19. Okay, so we did that, and I thought that immediately a lot of people were going to pop up and say, oh, I have this plane here sitting on the tarmac, I'm going to use it to do this, and for a year, nothing happened, okay? And then the first airline, you see there, the Twitter of the day that we did the inaugural flight of airline, which is going to connect four small cities in Argentina. It's an airline which has been built by the CEO is 20 years old, so it's he's not kind of bruised, by the frustrations that Argentina has subjected so many of to much of our business class. And after this guy started, we've had a deluge of people asking to do the same thing. Okay, so sometimes it's you have a time for things to mature. In this case, it took a year, okay? Then the second example where you see empty is labor reform. Argentina, the labor reform has been Argentina a big thing for ages. And so the president said to us, if you can implement I want a labor reform which is good for the worker or for the business. It has to be Pareto.
Oh, wow.
If it's not Pareto, go home, okay? I don't want a pro-business labor reform. I don't want a pro-worker labor reform. I want Pareto. So that what
Does he
we
use
did
these
in the
words,
basis
or
law...
you
Yeah, he uses,
Okay.
no, I mean, he uses this word. He doesn't like Pareto for other reasons, but he definitely uses that word. I mean, he's very, I mean, I've seen President Milei talking to a bunch of 8,000 people in a stadium talking about the Kakutani fixed point theorem, okay? And honestly, I've seen that myself, okay? So I'm not in person, okay? So it's a sight to be seen. So he enjoys theoretical economics very, very, very much. So he said, you have to do a win-win, okay? And so that what we did is that the contentions point for labor legislation is severance payments. I mean, they are associated to very high legal and economic cost and uncertainties. So what we said in the basis law is that each sector of activity could do a carve out of the labor law and design their own severance system. Okay, so that's it. I'm finished with labor reform. I have nothing else to do. And now you ask me, what has happened in this half year since the law? Nothing, absolutely nothing has happened, okay? So it's kind of the area, I mean, it's difficult to think of a Pareto thing. Everybody prefers to have the state kind of work in their favor, correct? So they keep us lobbying, both the unions and the business keep us lobbying us to change. I said, no man, we're not doing anything else. You have to find it. We basically got the state out of the thing, now you have to work. So, but so far, nothing has happened. And I think it requires creativity, it requires kind of accepting the format, having the lawyers accept that, etc. So there nothing has happened. But personally, I think the job has been done already. And then the last example I want to give you is that also in the executive decree, we allowed for pharmacies to sell medicines online, okay? And again, for a year, nothing happened. And there were substantial threats of the pharmaceutical industry if anybody would actually dare to do this because it would make prices more transparent. And finally, we have a big marketplace here, which is similar to a Latin American Amazon, which is called Mercado Libre. They set up a platform so that pharmacies could sell online, okay? And when some pharmacies started selling online, they started getting calls so that they should kind of withdraw their offers from the platform. Okay, and then we started an investigation in the antitrust competition, etc. Okay, now people are selling, digamos, online the medicines in some provinces because other provinces have forbidden the sale online of medicines. So sometimes you do the reform, but then the industry tries to coerce the participants in the industry so that the reform doesn't happen. If you ask me, I think freedom always finds its way. So it's a question of just being patient and pushing in the right direction. Eventually the reforms happen. So let me finish. I think I'm a little bit over my time.
We can go a little bit longer if you want.
Yeah, so I think in half an hour I have to be the finance minister because we have a big deregulation to work on, but several actually. So, but I think Javier Milei has defined what was possible or impossible. For example, I think economists in Argentina have kind of did not understand the full impact of having a fiscal surplus would have on the economy. So they were more afraid of attempting to go for the full fiscal surplus immediately. But also they undermined the possibility of it being done. So Javier Milei was saying, I'm going to have a fiscal surplus, and he attained the fiscal surplus in 1 month. So I think this is interesting. I mean, we have to revisit what we believe are the limits of what can be done and what cannot be done. So this is, you were asking me, Markus, of lessons for other countries. This would be an important one. We think this cannot be done. We think that the fiscal, I was talking to a Colombian friend, he said, well, we think we can lower the budget deficit 1.5 points in a year with a big, well, I mean, this guy lowered 5%. So you have to allow yourself to think more boldly, okay? And he has pushed deregulation to the core, and he's a true believer. I cannot see, Markus, how this has any relationship to democracy, which you mentioned in your introduction. I mean, I would say the contrary. I think deregulation is restoring the power to people. It's getting the state out of the way. I mean, regulation is an authoritarian state telling you can do this, you cannot do that, and so I think we have a freer and more, I would say, at least a freer society. I don't see how this has any. I would say the contrary. I mean that's the way the U.S. was created, correct? They wanted to get the state out of the way. So I think, and the U.S. is a strong democracy. So
let me ask you.
So
sorry.
Anyway, one last thing, and I finish. Milei has a very small cabinet. He reduced the number of ministries from 18 to 8. We're a very small group of people. We tend to think, we challenge our ideas all the time, but we think we want the same thing. That has made us very effective. The president supports the ministers very much. Of course, if he has to remove someone, he doesn't have a problem in doing that as well. And so that has made the government very efficient, I think. And my last thought, and with this I finish, is we also believe that freedom is a value in itself. I talk about deregulation as a pro-small firm, pro-business, anti-corruption, but we think freedom is a value to be aimed for on its own merits. And so we truly believe in this, and this is what we're pushing for, no?
I applaud you with that, but let me ask you a few questions. Do you have also examples where you said, oh, we went too far, or we had some collateral damage because we did this? And how do you contain that? Do you have some resilience method where you say, if something goes wrong, we can turn around, or do you have some response ready, or how do you do that then?
I always tell the story of, which is an Elon Musk biography, which he's trying to build that SpaceX, okay? And then someone tells him, we have to do this test, and then he says, this is in the Isaacson book, okay? And then he says, well, bring me the engineer who has suggested this so I can proceed to his firing, okay? So everybody's very nervous and say, oh no, it's NASA who's asking for this, and they're footing the bill, correct? And he says, oh, and now I understand why the rockets are $2 billion and not $150 million, because if in your regulation, I'll give you an example now, okay? But if in your regulation, you want to prevent all the risks, NASA has this thing, failure is not an option. Well, failure is not an option, it's very expensive, because it implies you have to put such much burden, let's say, on regulation to prevent everything. And look, and the bureaucrat, this is the first thing they say. They start saying, oh, I want to get rid, and then they start giving you a list of all the nasty things that can happen. They say, I don't know if those nasty things can happen. And you also have to put on the, on the la balanza, on the weight, on the other side of the weight, you have to put all the things that you're destroying by putting all these safeguards, okay? I'll give you an example. This Monday, as I told you, we removed we changed the navigation code, okay? So I'll tell you one thing which is obvious and one thing which goes to your question. So we basically force people to have a secondary electrical equipment on our boats. So I think this is thought for a boat that goes 4,000 miles into the South Atlantic. If you run out of electricity, and I said, look, listen, if you have $200 million and a crew of 80, and you actually decide to go 4,000 miles into the Atlantic, you know what you're doing, correct? It's not I'm in the street, let me go there, okay? So you need the state you need the government to tell them that you need electricity, okay? You just put the boat, okay? Now, but the problem, I imagine that we say that's okay. But then we have the boats which do our rivers. And the boats that do our rivers don't kind of separate from the coast more than 500 meters, okay? We ask them to have the electricity equipment as well. And the guy says, look, if I run out of electricity, I shout to the guy on the coast and say, throw me a rope, and then I go out, okay? So we eliminated all that, okay? But I think this is kind of pretty obvious. But it was still there.
Because you have a regulation for this type of boat and for a different type of boat, no? The quota is
Absolutely.
longer.
Well, here in this particular case, we apply the same thing to everybody, which was totally nonsense. But I'll give you another example, which is something that we're discussing. To get a boat into the port, you need something which is a guy who kind of brings the boat into the port. So, for example, if you are bringing a boat into the anchorage and you have an oil tanker and there are rocks, you may be a very good boat captain, but you need to know where are the rocks in anchorage, because if you kind of break the boat, you have an Exxon Valdez, okay? It's understood. So now, the problem is in the Rio La Plata, which is our thing that we have here, there are no rocks. It's only sand, okay? So if you actually don't have these guys, which charge you $50,000 each time they bring in a boat, whereas in Uruguay to bring a boat into the port, all the cost combined is $50,000. The only thing that you can never have an environmental thing, because the only thing that can happen is that the boat can hit a sand bank, and that's it, okay? And then you charge him a fine. Okay, big discussion as to whether we should make this thing optional or not, no? So we're going to make this thing optional. We just did it halfway optional on Monday, then we have another half that I have to do. So we'll see what happens, okay? Because we're bringing down a significant cost for trade in Argentina, which was there because we basically thought that there was this risk. Well, let's see if the risk is there. So I think you need, as a regulator or a deregulator, a big part of my job is convincing the areas that they should take more risks.
But then
Okay?
you're willing to
Now,
take more risks.
the taking of the risk implies...
implies, yes, I'm listening.
No, I was saying it implies that also I tell them, if we made a mistake, we go back. I mean, it's not a problem, but we need to explore this because we're going to, it's so much what we're going to create that we need to...
Is it typically then you go back or you have a plan B option?
No, I'll give you an example. For example, in the executive decree, we eliminated, there was I'll give you an example of going back, okay? We had very few going back because everything is so grotesque that you get rid. So I don't have that many examples of going back. I have one. So in the decree, we basically had to issue a thing which says who's the owner of a car, and then you had another one when a third party was going to drive the car. So you issued one which you gave to a third party. So we eliminated the third party. We say, look, if you have this thing, you can drive the car, okay? You have the original one, you can drive the car, you don't need to do the second one. Internally, it worked fine, but customs said that they felt uncomfortable when someone drove up to the customs with a car, and the car was a different owner, okay? I said, look, this is like you steal a car and you go to the police station to sign up. I don't think this is a real problem, but we could not convince them, okay? So basically what we did is we have an app in the government, it's called Mi Argentina, so we put there a procedure by which you can basically in the app grant permission to a third party to drive the car, okay? So we solved the problem, but it was a little bit like a going back to having this thing. We implemented in a different way, I think a more efficient way. Actually, everybody was happy, but I mean, sometimes maybe you don't have that alternative and you really have to reinstate the regulation. I mean, but I don't think we should think that either. I think that's a success, you know? I mean, if you've never missed a plane, Ricardo Hausman, my friends at Harvard said, if you never missed a plane, you spend too much time at airports, correct? So we have to allow ourselves to miss a plane and to be willing to correct and to be very attentive, because when the story I was telling you about Elon at the beginning, he basically tells the team, it's not about minimizing risk, it's about finding quickly when you have a problem and fixing it.
Two quick questions. I know you have to go. Do you put sunset provisions in your new regulations?
That's fantastic that you mentioned that. Our regulation, as you said, don't have sunset. I think what we found is that Texas is the only state which has sunset provisions on their laws. So now we're going to do a big thing where we're going to put a sunset clause on all the federal regulation. So we're going to say, for example, our Food and Drug Administration, which is called the SENASA. So we're going to tell them, look, by October 1st, you have to tell me which are your laws. Everything that you don't put in this book is gone. is repealed automatically. Okay, so this will allow us first to consolidate the legislation on different areas, imposing at the same time an automatic sunset clause. We haven't thought about doing a sunset clause, I would say, on a regular basis. We haven't thought that yet. I think it's an interesting idea to think about. But we're going to do kind of this application of the sunset through this, we call it bureaucracy zero, because we're basically saying, okay, you have to tell me which is your body of law, because in the Food and Drug Administration I mean, for example, now I'm repealing a law of 1973. One of the things I have to discuss with the minister now. I couldn't find it digitally, okay? So which basically does not allow to export cattle from Argentina alive, okay? And there are some, for example, Muslim countries that they want to buy the cattle alive because they basically kill the cattle with certain mechanisms and stuff. So nobody knew this thing was there, okay? I mean, they knew because you couldn't export, okay? But I mean, it kind of goes back so much in time that we rather have let you, instead of me trying to find out the pin in the haystack, that's the way you say it, it says, okay, just you tell me what you want to keep, and then we change a little bit the burden of proof. I know that you have to go,
but two more questions.
No,
ex ante was ex post regulation, Olivier asks. You know, do you have any take on this? And my second question is, all the initiatives you took, you know, by asking people and society, could you have done it 10 years ago or 15 years ago without the digitalization? Is this key? Or artificial intelligence?
Okay, it's two excellent questions. For example, Food and Drug Administration, you want to pack fruit, okay? So the way it worked now was that it gives you, the Food and Drug Administration says you have to comply with all of this. Okay, do it, and then I send an inspector to check if you comply with all of this, okay? So what we're basically changing now from ex ante to ex post. So I say, you have to comply with all of this. You tell me you have this, start. And then I send an inspector when I feel I need to send an inspector, okay? So basically, but we don't have people stopping. Of course, that's not a good example because actually we're also eliminating the requirement of checking anything on the food package. But anyway, that's a different. But yes, I think we need to go much more to the ex post, to the auditing ex post. I mean, trusting people. I mean, people are not here. Most of transactions are not done to fool someone else, to be a criminal. I mean, our customs law treats the person who's importing something as a criminal, okay? And we have to treat them as a person who wants to import something, okay, legally. And because, okay, so we're moving to the ex post. I think it's a very important component of the thing. And the second, sorry,
digitalization.
And the other one
is that you need
digitalization.
In a different way.
Yes, digitalization helps a lot, but I think the most important part has to do with the communication. Because digitalization helps a lot. It's easy to find the laws, but the fact, what I was telling you, I mean, for example, every morning I write a tweet explaining what is the regulation we did that day. I mean, some days I have nothing, some days I have two, etc. I mean, it's a process. That has turned out to be tremendously powerful.
And also that Milei.
And I was mentioning, I did do the regulation. I explained why it was crazy. It explains what it was trying to do. What I was telling you before, the president taking a stance publicly on an issue allows me to kind of move with the regulation. So all those things were not there 10, 15 years ago. Okay? In the case of Argentina, you have to add to that we come from 4 years of a very dark government, a government that, for example, did not buy the vaccines for COVID when they were offered by Pfizer, sent 20,000 people to death. They put us in our homes for a year. So we sent the authoritarian arm of the government in a way we had never seen before. Argentina for the last 15 years has been stagnant, and 2 million Argentines left, which is 5% of the population. And I think, and the people who left were people which were the sons and daughters of the rich, of the middle class, and of the poor. And I think as a society we realized that we were going to age seeing our kids and our grandchildren by Zoom.
I see. Yeah.
And I think this is what really shocked society, and made people realize that we needed a dramatic change. So I think those are specific things in Argentina, which I think have basically explained to some extent that the big support that Milei is getting in these reforms. People are totally fed up of a government has taxed them, has made the country impossible to live, have provided macroeconomic instability, and they said we need someone who really tackles the problems head on.
There are thousands of interesting questions I want to ask you, but I think you should go to your minister. So, for example, if you have more exposed regulation, of course, you also have to deal about the liability issues and how you deal with that. And if you think about Boeing, you're exposed to regulate, but then if something goes wrong, so that's also there are a lot of trade-offs there. Or if you have sunset provisions, it might create uncertainty for long-term investors. So, interesting questions popped up also in the chat box.
Absolutely.
But it's all fascinating, and I think it's good that you're going new ways, and that hopefully the rest of the world can learn something from your experience as well. Of course, every country is different and needs different measures, and probably less dramatic measures.
Absolutely.
But I think good luck with all the initiatives, and I hope that Argentina will prosper and do extremely well, and all citizens.
The fight for freedom is tough, but it's worth it. So we're having the time of our life.
Good. Thanks again, and hope we stay in touch.
Thank you so much for having me, Markus.
Thank you.
All the best.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Good luck. Thanks. Cheers.